Yo, it's Karkat. Today we're diving back into game development, but before we do, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone who watched and commented on the last one. It's extremely encouraging to know there are people hoping I'll stick with it so they can eventually try the game. So if you're worried about me staying motivated to work on this project, that's the exact kind of stuff that'll keep me going, and I really appreciate it. Last time, we went from a vanilla Unreal template to a project with basic dual dagger combat and the ability to kill enemies and spawn in the enemies we killed to fight for us. The next thing we should probably do is implement a simple version of a game mode, which for us will simulate a dungeon from solo leveling. So you fight some enemies, then fight the dungeon boss, and that's how you beat the dungeon. Before we get into development though, there's one step that we definitely shouldn't skip because it's crucial for any game that you're serious about developing: drafting a game design document. It's not the most exciting thing we can do, but it'll help us nail down all the details that we might otherwise handwave and will act as a one-stop shop for brainstorming the entire concept of the game. It's going to be a small document, but it'll get bigger as we move through development. For now, my working title for this game is just Summoner. Short, to the point, and it kind of sounds like an indie game, which is the vibe we're going for. It can be really helpful to create a one-liner comparison to 2 or 3 other games to help people immediately start to visualize what the game will be. For that, I chose RoboQuest meets Devil May Cry. I like the idea of RoboQuest's main hub, where you can select the difficulty of your run before you start it. It has the roguelite elements, and then Devil May Cry has that third-person ARPG combat that feels really dynamic, flashy, and anime-esque. Then we just need to explain each component of the game. So we've got the gameplay loop, which we know will involve progressively harder dungeons, killing enemies and bosses, upgrading our character, and starting over if we die or beat the game, assuming it's not in endless mode. We want to outline the core mechanics, so the player's movement and combat options, how resurrection will work, what the initial upgrade ideas are. While I was writing, I was thinking that making a whole roguelike system where you get the random upgrade options when you level up and can make different types of builds might not fit that well with the theme of the game. So I reflected a bit more on the source material this game is drawing from and thought what could be really cool is doing a roguelite inspired RPG progression system. So instead of clicking on cards to get upgrades, the enemies you kill will have loot tables and will drop a mixture of gear, equipment, and maybe some stat boosts you can use or something. Once I landed on this and thought about it a bit more, the idea started feeling pretty good, so I think that's the direction I want to move in. Then we've got the maps and enemies. For that, we can keep pulling from solo leveling, with dungeons like an abandoned subway station, cave, a castle, and early enemy types being wolves and goblins, and then eventually you're fighting elves and demons. Finally, we've got the art style, which I would love to have as that cel-shaded anime vibe from games like Genshin Impact and Breath of the Wild, and a roadmap that outlines some of the big features we'll want to make first. And there we go, a much clearer direction to move in, and goals we can now target with our development. Before we get into designing the dungeons, there are a couple of small bugs and things I want to fix. First, I set up a function timer so the combat enemy is constantly updating their target to whoever is closest, but I placed it after branching based on hostility, so only our summons update their targets. This is an easy fix. I can actually just place the node outside the function itself, so it gets called regardless of what happens inside. Next, I want to remove the physics-based knockback on every hit. It's pretty janky and won't feel good when we tighten up the game field down the line, so let's disable that, and what is going on? On hit, the units are ragdolling on every bone but the pelvis. Wow, that looks insane. Finally, let's turn our summons green to make it easier to distinguish between allies and enemies. That's looking better. Now, for us to start sculpting this demo into something that even remotely resembles a video game, we need to implement the game mode. The game mode is essentially the rules that govern what happens and when, what triggers the game to start, how do you win, how do you lose, that sort of stuff. We'll write all the logic for that in the game mode blueprint, which is a core Unreal blueprint that goes hand in hand with the others you see here. The pawn class is the actor that players spawn in as by default. The HUD class is the default HUD. The controller class is meant to handle player input, although it's often handled directly on the pawn. The game state houses the logic for anything you want to track or modify about the state of the game. The player state does the same thing but for the player, and the spectator class is what the player controls by default when their pawn is destroyed. That's a lot to remember, but it's important to note that while these classes have specific properties that make them uniquely suited for their roles, when it comes to Unreal, you can really code anything anywhere and get it to a state that works. You can put player controller type logic on the player pawn, or even game mode type logic on the player state, and it would sometimes be a silly, janky, or even dumb thing to do, but you could make it functional, at least for a single player game. Anyway, for us, we're going to handle a bunch of stuff on the game mode and mostly ignore the game state for now, unless something specific comes up. Let's duplicate our demo level and expand it a bit to make it look more like a linear dungeon. I'm thinking for the overall flow of a dungeon, you spawn in at the beginning with all the enemies already placed at their initial starting point, and you progress through at your own pace, aggroing enemies along the way. This will make it more like an MMO dungeon rather than a typical roguelike, where enemies are continuously spawning in around you. Then you progress to the boss and kill it to end the level. We can place some spawn point actors around the map, and then we just have to start coding out that flow in the game mode blueprint. We'll start by creating some custom events to organize the logic for each thing that needs to happen for the dungeon to progress. First, we want to get a reference to all the spawn points, and use each to spawn in an enemy. We can create variables to track how many enemies we want to spawn in total, as well as the enemies currently alive, so once that number hits 0, we can trigger the end of the dungeon. Last enemy dies, print statement called, boom, simple. Now we can add an additional required flag to end the round, whether or not the boss has died. Our boss for now will just be a bigger version of the regular enemy, and we can spawn him at the end of the dungeon. Now you have to kill all the regular enemies and the boss for the dungeon to end. Last enemy dies, boss dies, Boom. Round ends, and we could even summon the boss back in to fight for us already. Now that we have a bare bones game mode, from here we can really choose to move our development in any direction we want, whether that's fleshing out the game mode more, creating new mechanics, or working on game feel. It can be tempting to jump right into adding a badillion game mechanics to start making the demo more complex and featured, but I think the more disciplined approach is really to dial in the fundamental game feel as much as possible. Because if we can just make the base combat feel fun, then we know that adding more mechanics will enhance the game instead of trying to obfuscate the core gameplay being unfun. With that in mind, I think we should direct our energy towards making combat feel more smooth and engaging, starting with the player controls and then moving on to the enemy AI. I've been trying to decide what kind of combat system would fit best for this type of game, mainly between the more loose camera lock-on style you see in a lot of RPGs like Zelda and Dark Souls, or the free-flow combat systems from games like Arkham Asylum and Spider-Man. I think for now, going with the former is the better option because it's simpler to develop and, in my opinion, less gimmicky. The blueprint implementation is actually fairly simple. We can create an input on the middle mouse button that, when clicked, shoots out a multi-sphere trace in the direction you're facing and saves the first enemy it collides with as a variable. Then all we have to do is, on tick, face the player pawn towards the enemy if the variable has an enemy saved. So we hook that up, test the trace, walk up to an enemy, and boom, simple lock-on complete. Next, let's create a branch off the input based on whether the variable is valid. In other words, if we've locked onto the target. If we haven't, we run the code we just wrote, but if we have, all we have to do is set the variable to nothing. Then the on-tick event will know to stop forcing the camera to face a certain way. Now we can lock on and lock off at will. The last thing we can do to make this feel even better is, after killing a locked-on target, immediately locking on to the next closest enemy. For that, we'll use an event dispatcher, which in Unreal is an extremely useful way to have two different blueprints communicate with each other. The event dispatcher is on the enemy blueprint, and when the enemy dies, we call the dispatcher to notify any other blueprints that have subscribed to it that the enemy is dead. Then, back on our player pawn, we just need to subscribe to that event dispatcher anytime we lock onto an enemy, and create the event that will get called whenever the enemy dies. This is pretty intermediate stuff, so if it doesn't make sense immediately, don't stress too much about it. Now, for locking onto the next closest target, I want to include enemies that are behind the player too. So for that, we can trace an actual sphere around the player that grabs the closest enemy to them. To avoid writing the same code over again with slightly different parameters, let's grab the multi-trace logic and place it into its own event, with input pins that determine the start, end, and radius of the trace. This will allow us to route the flow of logic into the same code, just specifying different parameters based on the type of trace we want at that time. Now you can see when an enemy dies, we fire a sphere trace around the player that allows us to immediately lock onto the next closest target, and already the combat is starting to feel more like an actual game. I just want to add one more thing before we wrap this up. You may have noticed that as soon as I start the level, the enemies immediately start pathing towards me, such that when I walk into the room, they're already bunched up at the beginning trying to get to me. This looks really silly, and is definitely not how I want the game to work. I'm envisioning it kind of like an MMO dungeon where the enemies are stationary until you enter their aggro range, so let's code that out and see how it feels. In the enemy character blueprint, we can create variables representing if the enemy is currently aggroed and what the aggro range is, then write a function that compares the distance between the enemy and the player to the aggro range, and sets our new boolean to true if the player is close enough. Then all we have to do is peek inside the enemy state tree again and add that boolean as a condition to start the entire tree. Don't forget to call the functions you write, something I do all the time, and now we just walk up to the enemies, and boom, they're aggroed. And that feels like a solid stopping point on a video that admittedly took longer to make than I intended. We drafted a game design document, prototyped the structure of our game mode, and got the combat from janky, chaotic, and unstructured to janky, slightly less chaotic, and slightly more structured. I want to thank you guys for sticking around to watch this far, and for your patience. Juggling the main channel, IRL stuff, and the fact that these videos take hours of game dev before even starting the video edit means they won't be nearly as frequent as I wish they were, but that's not going to stop me. I hate to admit it, but I'm already fighting against the feeling that I'll never have the time or consistency to take this in a meaningful direction because of how hard it is to make a game. And that to me is really the hardest part about making an indie game. But this video is proof that that feeling hasn't won yet, and I will just keep slowly working on this demo and making videos about it, because at the end of the day, I love it. Anyway, let me know in the comments what you think I should add to the game next, and I'll see you guys soon. Peace!